This Giant TCR frame was once destined for landfill.
Yeah.
Then Rob from Carbon Bike Repair UK fixed the damage so that we could document the process. Now I also have this Giant Defy, and I'm going to be transferring everything from this Giant Defy to this Giant TCR, spending as little money as possible. How hard can that be? Definitely a little bit rough. Will everything actually fit? No idea. All of this is going to be done by me in my shed with limited tools to keep the cost down. Now I'm doing this video to test the carbon repair, but also to show a cheaper option to buy in a brand new road bike, because costs are quite frankly getting out of hand. Now you can pick up frames like this pretty cheap on eBay these days. Now I'm no mechanic, but armed with determination and a YouTube degree in bike repair, let's see if we can bring this bike back to life. Before we get going, I wanted to see how much the Giant weighs so that I can take a comparison at the end of the video with the new TCR. Now the total was 8,550 grams, so 8.5 kilos basically, which is not bad considering that this bike is actually 8 years old. The new frame is the SL super light version of the 2016 Giant TCR, and the frame and the forks weigh a total of 1,165 grams. Again, not too bad considering the age. Now on the topic of the TCR frame, there is a full video on the repair, but basically I hit it with a hammer. It took way more to break it than I was actually expecting. Rob from Carbon Bike Repair then repaired the frame back to its former glory.
We put the nappy on the repair.
For me to then build the bike back up and put it to the test. Now, I'll be honest, the frame is hardly a pretty picture. It's had a hard life, so it's a good experiment bike. Size-wise, it's a medium, and looking on Geometry Geeks, it matches my L's Vanyar roughly, the pinch of salt, and I've had a full bike fit on that bike, so I know it should be roughly right. There was only one thing left to do, and that is pick up the tools. However, there was one thing that nearly stopped this build from getting started, and that is this built-in seat tube. It's part of the carbon frame, and it's already been cut down to size. Now, if this is too short, it will be game over. I've had a couple of bike fits, and I know I need my seat at 755 mil, so 75.5 centimeters. From the center of the bottom bracket to the ALM, the anatomical landmark on the saddle. Now out came the tape measure, and from the bottom bracket to the top of the seat tube was 68 centimeters. Then from the saddle to the rails is around 5 centimeters, and that gives us 73 centimeters. Now looking at the clamp, think we can add a couple of centimeters with that, but you can also add these washers in to raise it a little bit. So after a mild panic, think we may be looking good, but we'll find out later in the video. So I had a spring in my step, then I had a Google and realized that the seat clamp alone is 60 pounds.
Are you joking?
I know, I thought it was a joke at first, but looking around, these things are like gold dust. So much for this being a cheap build. I'll keep a running list of things that we need to solve, and the seat clamp can be the first on the list. Now I know what I've got myself into, and you guys know why. Let me show you a true professional mechanic at work. Obviously, that's sarcasm. I'm a YouTuber. Take what you see with a pinch of salt. So we can now set the Defy up in the stand, clamping the seat tube ready to be deconstructed. First, the front wheel comes off with the quick release skewer. Then putting the chain in the smallest cog at the rear makes the rear wheel easier to get off. The skewer was pretty stiff, which is probably a sign of things to come. Now I need some rim brake wheels, so I'll add that to the list of things to solve because these wheels aren't going to fit their disc brake. I undone the rear brake clamping bolt. When pulling the cable out, the end cap was pretty much stuck in the barrel adjuster. I told you this would be a professional video. It broke free and I reseated the barrel adjuster in the caliper. Now the front brake was similar, but this time the cable came away from the end cap, so I used a long nose pliers to grip and pull it free. The rear gear cable was straightforward and came straight out. The front gear cable was pretty beat up and probably the worst of all the cables on the bike. Now I can get the chain out of the way. I use this specific tool to undo the magic link and then pull the chain through the derailleur and the chain rings. I'll bag this up because it has more grease on it than a KFC extractor fan. The rear derailleur is a simple one and it's removed with a single bolt which is attached to the rear derailleur hanger. It's looking pretty good considering that this has done around 6,000 miles I believe. Honestly, this Ultegra group set has never missed a beat for me. The old school stuff was definitely built to last. Now let's hope the derailleur hanger fits to the TCR. Wishful thinking. To undo it, there are two little bolts that hold it on. Luckily, a little bit of force and they both came free. When I offered it up against a TCR, it was pretty clear though that this wasn't going to fit. Unsurprising to be honest. So I'll add that to the list of the things that we need to solve. I guarantee you, we will solve everything on that list by the end of this video. I think. The bottle cage can then be undone, we need that out of the way. Then the front derailleur can be removed. This is one simple mounting bolt and then it's free, along with a lot of crust and road dirt. The derailleur is not in bad nick for its age, it just needs a good clean. With the front derailleur out the way, we can remove the front derailleur hanger. Again, this is two small bolts. Let's see if this fits on the TCR. Now when offering it up, it seems pretty good. So I screwed it in and everything aligned correctly. Looking on the Giant spare parts website as well, this part actually fits the Defy Advanced 2016 and the TCR, so that gives us the confirmation that we need. I do have a feeling that I'm going to be spending a little bit too much time on the Giant spare parts website though. Next up, the cranks and chain rings. I did actually replace these probably 1,000 to 2,000 miles ago. Now a quick spin and these felt pretty rough to be honest, more like a grinding mill than a smooth bottom bracket. I could probably grind some grains into flour with this thing. Now the non-drive side is secured with two bolts. They were definitely tight, but didn't put up too much of a fight. The tension bolt can then be removed with this little Shimano tool. Now the crank arm is also in okay condition, not too much to report. The axle was tight and didn't really want to budge, so like we have done in before, we turned the nearest tool that isn't a hammer into a hammer and gave it a few love taps. It wasn't too tight to be honest, and once it had moved slightly, it pretty much came free. Looking at the spindle, it seems okay to me. I've not seen too many used Shimano spindles, so let me know what you think in the comments down below. To remove the cables from the frame, first I remove the cable outer on the rear gear cable and then the rear cable grommet. Then I can simply pull the cables through the frame. All of them came through without issue. If only it was that easy, getting them all in the damn bikes. There is this little frame insert that keeps the cable secure that go through the frame. I'm going to try this on the TCR. It's secured by this little bolt, which I was worried about, again, given it's 8 years old and the bolt's tiny, but it came out okay, so testament to Giant. It also fits the TCR, kind of, if you squint with one eye and then look the other way. We may need to get a new one, we may be able to use this, let's see. On the other side of the TCR there is another little insert which is missing, annoyingly. We can add that to the list of things that we need to solve. I can then remove the inner cables from the shifters. I can get to this by pulling the lever and then gripping the end of the cable and pulling it through. For the gears, you access it from the outer edge of the shifters. The hood's got rolled back, the insert removed, and then I change the gear to align the cable with the exit, and that allows you to pull the cable through on each side. I went to remove the shifters and I remembered I can just keep the shifters, bar and stem all together and slide them straight onto the new forks. Or so I thought. Now, this is all we need from the old girl, the Giant Defy. It's been emotional, and this bike hasn't skipped one beat since I bought it 4 years ago. So you're probably thinking you're mad for taking it apart. I actually spent my 30th birthday riding through the Cotswolds. We've been connected through my gooch for 6,000 miles, and it was the bike that got me hooked on cycling and spawned this channel. Your spirit will live on through the TCR. Enough of the gooey stuff, let's take a look at the TCR. Now before I get ahead of myself, I want to make sure various parts actually fit so we can start the build. Firstly, we need a compression plug, so I grabbed one from my box of spares from previous AliExpress purchases, and we have one that is roughly the right size. Winner. So I chucked that into the stem and tightened it up to 7 Newton meters. Then I slid the bottom bearing on. Clearly, it was nowhere near fitting. I had some spare bearings from previous builds, but again, they were either too loose or just didn't sit right. So it looks like I need a new headset bearing and maybe a bearing seat as well to go on the fork. I'll add that to the list of things to solve. It doesn't stop there though. The steerer tube on the fork also felt a little bit chunky. And when I tried the stem, lo and behold, the stem didn't fit. Turns out that the Giant TCR Advanced SL from 2016 uses the Overdrive 2 system, which is basically a larger steerer tube at 1 1/4 inch, opposed to the standard of 1 1/8. This list is growing a little more than I'd anticipate, and it's not looking good, it's looking costly. I do have some little gems though that makes me feel a little bit better, and here they are. They are the Derailleurs 7900 brake calipers. So I tried them in the frame and the front was all good, but the rear securing bolt was way too long. So I'll add that to the list of things to buy / solve that I just keep adding to. At this point, I had quite a few things that need to be ordered, so I jumped on the Giant spare site and found some bits I need. Firstly, the frame cable stopper for the rear brake, that was £4.50. Small, but a vital piece of the puzzle. Then painfully, the Giant seat post clamp, which was £64.99. I'm not happy buying that. While I was browsing online as well, they also had this little bottom bracket guide, and I realised that I don't have it, so I added that to my basket as well, and that was £4.50. I also needed the rear derailleur hanger, which was £16. Strangely, it seems that this part is not actually as common as I would have thought. I thought I could get a cheap one off eBay or something. Then there is this Overdrive 2 headset, which by the way is a real pain because it wipes out so many second-hand parts that I could otherwise buy and use. Also, the headset from Giant is £30. Of course there's more. I needed a stem. Again, this Overdrive 2 sizing came back to bite me. I wanted a stem fairly quick so I could crack on with the build. So I bought the Giant official one, which came in at £30. Sadly, that brings a grand total so far to £150 without the wheels. So the moral of the story is, if you are buying a second-hand frame, make sure all the little parts are included because they add up really quick. So now we have all the parts, I think, time for the build. Now keep in mind, I've never built a rim brake bike before, so this isn't a how-to, but I will show you all the wins, all the fails, all my mistakes. This is real life, my friends. So first up, I don't want to start with a dirty frame, so I whipped out the GT85, nothing like a good rub down in the summer house alone.
A hobby.
First on the agenda was to check the forks with the newly purchased headset bearings, because if they don't fit, it's back to the drawing board. Now I can slide the forks into the frame, and to be honest, the bottom race does sit quite well in the frame and it's pretty smooth. The upper bearing and this little compression ring thing, no idea if that's the correct name, but that's what we're going with, goes in the upper bearing seat, and we can then slide the bearing cover on and it's all looking good. We can see straight away though that we are going to need some spacers. So I went to my parts drawer, found some spacers, only to realise that they are for a 1 1/8 steerer tube, and they don't fit the 1 1/4 inch Giant Overdrive steerer tube. Honestly, this Giant Overdrive 2 is killing me. However, I then had a thought. Maybe I can cut the steerer tube down. I'll have a think and we will decide in a little bit. I then wanted to install the frame inserts that I purchased, so I started with the insert on the top tube. This is where the rear brake inner cable is going to enter the frame. Then I realised I actually needed another one where it exited the frame. I'll add that to the list of things to order as well. At this point, I gave my friend Francesco a call, who runs a bike shop in London. He's a mechanic, to get some general advice before I jumped in to see if there was anything else I actually needed or had missed. He gave me lots of advice on the phone and tips, which I'll be putting into practice shortly. He also pointed out that I don't have inner liners for the inner cables, gear cables that go through the frame. These prevent the cables from rubbing together and also rubbing on the frame, which could introduce some friction. So I'll add that to the list of things that I missed. This is really racking up. A big shout out to Francesco. If you need anything bike related and you live in London, then give him a call. He is based in East London and he built my Elves Vanya last year as well. So I'll leave his details down below.
Oh, friend!
Now I also have the rear derailleur hanger that simply screws into the frame with 2 little bolts. These bolts feel delicate, so I went pretty easy when tightening them up. Now I can chuck the stem onto the bike. This is pretty straightforward. I'm just putting everything on roughly in place right now to make sure everything fits. For the front brake caliper, you can slide the screw into the frame and that marries up with the bolt the other side. So once I had the bolt aligned, I then tightened it roughly. I'll need to adjust it later when the wheels are on anyway, so I won't do it up to spec now. For the eagle-eyed viewers, you'll remember that I needed to buy a small mounting bolt for the rear brake caliper. Yeah, I didn't do that. Instead, what I'm going to do is steal one from my wife's bike. Don't worry, I'll replace it at some point in the distant future. With the goods acquired, I can mount the rear caliper to the frame and the job's a good one. The derailleurs need a little TLC, so I got some drive chain cleaner, gave it a spray down and then a good rub. They are old components, so I'm not looking for a spit shine here, just making them look a little bit more presentable for the build. I also put some grease on the barrel adjusters because I know these love to stiffen up over time.
Ow.
Now this era of Shimano group sets does seem bulletproof. This derailleur still has so much spring in it, and it's crazy considering that it is 8 years old and covered around 10k miles, did I say 6,000 miles? I don't know, a lot of miles. Then I can add a little grease to the single mounting bolt and tighten it into the frame. This is going nowhere, so we can tighten it up to the correct torque, which is 8 Newton meters. The front then got the same treatment. There was far more grime on this one though, but I got it all cleaned up. You do know it's bad though when you have to bring out the screwdriver to scrape away chunks of dirt. Once it was a little bit more presentable, I mounted it to the bike using the single mounting bolt and the sort of washer that goes with it that allows you to adjust the angle. So at this point, I paused for a few days because I needed the additional parts to arrive. So another lesson learned, really go over the bike and buy everything you need up front. That will make sure that the build process actually goes smoothly. Otherwise, you'll be doing what I've been doing, and that's sitting around twiddling your thumbs, basically having a fun war, wasting time. A few days passed and I was thinking about the spacers and the steerer tube, and after much deliberation out on a ride one day, I thought, you know what, I'm gonna get home, I'm gonna cut them down so that I don't need these spacers. From my complex calculations, that will be the best fit for me anyway. To do this, I can first mark the steerer tube. Now let me explain the way this all works. When you tighten the top cap, everything is compressed. So the top cap will press down on the top of the stem and simultaneously it will pull the forks up. What this does is takes out any play in the headset, and by play we mean any movement, sort of wiggling if you like. But this means that the steerer tube needs to be lower than the top of the stem by around 3 millimeters. And that way when we tighten the stem cap, there is 3 millimeters for everything to compress. Make sense? So to do this, I made a mark on the stem. This is where the top of the stem currently sits, not where we're gonna cut. Then I can remove the forks and the headset from the frame before making a second mark. This second mark is gonna be 3 mil lower than the first mark. As we just said, this is for the compression. Then we can remove the compression plug. We definitely don't want to be cutting through that. Then I grab my little jewelry vise, which I bought for a few quid on eBay a few years ago. Then I install the Lifeline fork cutting guide into the clamp, ready to receive the forks. Now the forks slide nicely in and I can align the cutting line with the second mark that we made on the fork. Now to cut through the forks, I have this hacksaw that I bought from Screwfix, and that has a 32 TPI tooth per inch cutting blade. Slow and steady wins a race. We don't need to force down with loads of pressure. We basically have a light pressure and long and consistent strokes.
Behave.
The cut actually came out really, really nice. I'm really happy with the result. There was no shards or sharp bits and we're good to go. Now to put it all back together, first we can put the compression plug back in and torque it up to 8 Newton meters. The role of the compression plug is to give the stem something to clamp against. So the compression plug is essentially pushing outwards and the stem is pressing inwards. So it gives the carbon steerer tube extra support. We can grease the crown race this time, the bottom bearing, then the fork can go through the frame, and we can add the top bearing along with this little compression ring thingy-mabob. This bearing cover got a little grease, and then I pushed that onto the steerer tube as well. Now the stem can go on, followed by the stem bolt, which we can tighten down to remove that play we were talking about earlier. I tend to tighten, then check, then tighten, then check. I do that until a point where I'm happy with how everything's feeling. Then the stem bolts can be tightened. We will torque them later when we have the wheels on to check all the alignment. Now for the brake cables. If you are setting up cables while watching this, then watch till the end because I made some mistakes. So let's start with the rear. I have the little frame insert that we needed. That goes in the bike towards the rear, so I added that in with the little screw. We can tick that off the list of things to solve. Nice, the list is getting shorter. On the Giant, the brake cable went all the way through the frame, so it was one solid length of outer. I need to cut it down, so I measured how much cable I would need and gave it the snip. I can then push the rear brake cable through the shifter. To do this, you pull the shifter as if you were going to brake, then slide the cable through. The end of the cable sits nicely in the shifter, so I made sure it was properly seated in there. I can then slide the outer housing onto the inner cable and secure that into the shifter. Now the inner cable can then go through the frame. I realized this would be impossible to get out near the rear with that frame insert installed, so I whipped that back out quickly. I can then thread the cable through the frame, eyeball when it gets near the rear, and when it showed its face, I hooked it out with a tiny little Allen key. I can then slide this little insert onto the inner cable and secure it in the frame. I need another bit of cable outer for the rear, so I simply measured by placing it against the frame and cut another section to size. I fed the outer cable onto the inner cable. I have this little reducer end cap thing that fits perfectly into the barrel adjuster. That went in perfectly and everything is looking good. At least it's looking good to my untrained eyeballs. I can then repeat the process with the front brake. So first, measure the cable length. Then I can install the inner cable through the front of the shifter, and then the outer cable slides onto the inner cable. Then I can install the cable end along with the end cap before routing everything to the caliper itself. When I tested the bars, the front cable definitely felt a little too short. Now, what I hadn't thought about is that when the brake is in its final position, so the pads are basically closer to the wheel, where the cable ends is actually lower than when I had set it all up. So it all came off and I cut another outer piece down to size and slid that into place. You know what I just love doing the most? Like, it's really enjoyable just repeating the same thing twice. I then tape the brake cables to the frame to secure them roughly in place. It also allows me to play with the bars and make sure they can move freely. Now for the gears. Now the gear cables are a little bit more complex. Both the gear cables go into the frame at the head tube. Then when they enter the frame, they go through the inner cable guides down towards the bottom bracket. Now the first thing I need to do is replace the old frame insert, which I installed earlier in the video, with the correct one that I purchased. That one that I purchased had the inner cable guides attached. We can also tick that off the list of things to solve. For the front, we fed the inner cable through the shifter. This is done by removing the little side insert on the shifter and feeding the cable through. You need to be in the correct gear here, or the cable will not go through, it will not pass. I fed the outer onto the inner cable, ensuring there was a cable end at the shifter. This is how it was set up on the Giant, so I'm simply replicating what was there. I could also place the inner through the frame and send it towards the front derailleur. The bottom bracket isn't installed yet, so we have good access to see where everything is and how it's all routed. Again, I rolled back the hood, removed the little insert and fed the inner cable through the shifter. I can then measure and cut the outer cable to length and slide it onto the inner, ensuring the cable end is present at the shifter. The inner cable can then slide into the frame guide. I was playing around with the bottom bracket routing, seeing how the puzzle fits together, thinking, oh yeah, I'm making good progress. Then I realized I had the inner cables the wrong way around. The rear inner cable is longer than the front inner cable so that it can reach the back of the bike.
Logical.
So off camera, I swapped it all around so that they were correct. With the cables the correct way around, I can then play with the bottom bracket guide. For me, the easiest way to secure this in place was to have the inner cables and guides at the exit of the bottom bracket of the frame and then place them back into the frame, routing the cables towards their final destinations. As you can see, each cable has a specific slot on this plastic bottom bracket guide, and I need to remember to screw that little bolt in. Now, an elephant in the room and a big cost on the list, the wheels. However, to keep the cost down, I'm going to be using these Campagnolo Zonda wheels, which I bought for around £140 2-3 years ago. Now they were for a vintage rally Corsa that I restored. However, they have been sitting there wasting away, so we should put them to good use. Now, I'm not sure if the 11-speaker set will work with these. I'm pretty sure it should, so let's find out. To do that, first I'll remove the 11-speaker set from the Giant wheels. To do that, I need my chain whip, the cassette tool, 24mm socket and a large torque wrench. Gripping the cassette with the chain whip, I can then apply opposite pressure with the torque wrench and loosen the lock-in nut. Don't follow my lead here, people. Don't use a torque wrench to undo bolts. They should be used to tighten bolts. But this was the only thing I had to hand. Now to remove the cassette on the Zondas, we can use the same process. However, the skewer was pretty tight in there and it wouldn't come loose. So again, I turned the nearest tool into a hammer. Ultimately, it broke free, and I'll be honest, the bearings are far from perfectly smooth, but for now, they will do. Then, using some force, I was able to break the cassette locking nut free and remove the cassette. I'll probably replace them later or have them serviced in the near future. Then I can install the 11-speed cassette on the Zondas, which is done by simply sliding all the cogs on one by one, ensuring that there is a spacer where required. I started the locking nut off by hand because it's a delicate little thing. Then I use a torque wrench set to 40 Newton meters to tighten it up. It's always a good idea to check for any play and make sure that the cassette is very tight and make sure it's not going anywhere. At this point, I had another play with the handlebars to check over all the cables and look over where I'm at. And truth be told, I wasn't happy with the way the cables were interacting. What I realized is when you put one cable in, it's free to move wherever it likes. With 4 cables in, they are not free to move around wherever they like. They will hit the other cables. So I spent some time looking at pictures of existing bikes online to see how it's supposed to look. And then I did my best to replicate that. My changes definitely made an improvement, which is proof that even a blind squirrel can find nuts sometimes. With the rear gear cable, there is this little insert that we can slide onto the inner cable and then push into the frame. This is exactly the same as a Giant, so we just reuse it. Now we have all the cables installed, we can look to tackle the bottom bracket. Now I had this Cynics bottom bracket and it was spare from a previous build and I'm going to be using that. A quick check to make sure that no cables inside are going to be hitting the bottom bracket and we can begin the install. I personally like to grease the frame slightly to aid the installation and stop the sort of creaking. I've seen people use retaining compound, but truth be told, I want the next person to be able to get this out in a few years' time, probably me. Then I can grab my Lifeline bearing press. I'm going to start with the drive side, so I'm going to do one side at a time. Then I started twisting. It was making a creaking noise and some sounds that are definitely not my favourite at all, but eventually it was pressed into the frame. Then I can do the same for the other side, this time using the 24mm adapter on both sides. I must say that this side was far smoother. There was no gripping and then the bearing sort of jumping in a touch. With every turn, the bearing went in nice and smooth. I then gave everything a good check over to ensure the bearings were flush against the frame. Overall, I am happy with the install, but I have pushed things in easier before.
Have you?
With the bottom bracket in place, we can install the crankset. First, I gave the cranks a quick clean just to get rid of that surface grime. Then I greased the axle, specifically where the axle is going to sit on the bearings. With a good lathering up, I can then slide the axle through the bottom bracket. This may be a little bit tight and require some persuasion. Once it's through the frame, we can grab the non-drive side crank arm, which again got a little clean. We can place the crank arm onto the spline, making sure it's 180 degrees in relation to the other crank arm. If it's not, then I'm pretty sure that your cadence and your knees are going to hate you. With that in place, we can then add the crank arm fixing bolt. Now this thing is similar to the clamping bolt on the stem. Its purpose is to tighten enough to take out the play in the cranks, but not overly tighten so that cranks can't actually spin. We can then tighten the crank arm bolts. Each one of these needs to be done up to 14 Newton meters. Now it's time to put the wheels on the bike so she can stand on her own 2 feet. What a moment. To make sure they are seated correctly, I placed her down gracefully for the first time. She took her first steps and I retightened the wheels, this time with gravity on my side. She stands. We are making solid progress. With the wheels on, let's align the brakes. First thing, I adjusted the caliper so that it was central as possible to both pads hitting the rim at the same time. Then I can pull any slack through the cable so that it's super tight. Press the caliper towards the rim so it's pretty much touching. Then I can tighten the clamping bolt. When I gave the wheel a spin, there was no rubbing at all and I was happy with the amount of brake pull at the lever and how the pads are touching the wheel. I can then cut the cable down to size and install the cable end. I can then do the same for the rear, making sure to give the inner cable a good pull to remove any slack. Then I push the calipers together and tighten the bolt. When I pulled the lever, the brake pads weren't touching the rim at the right place. It wasn't quite correct angle. So I undone the pad bolt, positioned them correctly and pulled the lever to make sure the alignment was correct. I can then tighten the bolt back up. I did this on both sides of the caliper to ensure both pads were correct. And we are good to go. The lever pull is good for both shifters. Onto the gears. For the front, I realised that I need to cut this outer protector down to length. This was a delicate operation with a sharp blade. Now when pulling slack through for the front derailleur, you want to make sure that you are in the smallest chainring at the shifter. Give the lever a few clicks to make sure you are. This is because in that position, That's where the most slack is. I also checked the high and low limit screws at this point off camera and they were all good. I tried the gears and everything seemed okay. Then I realized another mistake. I didn't set the height of the chainring. If I adjust this now, it will adjust the cable tension. So basically I repeated the exact same steps all over again, but first I set the front derailleur height, ensuring that there was a few millimeters between the front derailleur cage and the largest chainring. A quick check at the lever and we are looking good. I told you it'll be the full build, mistakes and all. For the rear, I want the chain installed. So to check the sizing, I use a big to big method. This is where you place the chain on the biggest chainring at the front and the biggest cog at the rear on the cassette. Then you can find the nearest links that the chain could actually join. Then from there, you add 2 links on. Now this chain was actually the correct size, or so I thought. So I began routing the chain through the rear derailleur and then securing it in place with the magic link or quick link. However, when I had a check through the gears, when I was in the smallest ring at the back and the smallest chainring at the front, which you shouldn't do by the way, because that's basically cross chaining, makes chain bend. The chain was actually hitting the derailleur though, the derailleur cage, which definitely isn't correct. Everything online was basically saying that the chain's too long. So I then took the chain off and removed the minimum amount of links I could, ensuring that I'm left with 2 inner links, which will allow me to use a magic link. Another quick check and everything seemed okay. The chain wasn't hitting the rear derailleur cage anymore. So I'm going to be sticking with that for now. Now with the chain on, we can look at the rear gear. Now I use a specific technique to pull the slack through. First, what I do is push the derailleur into the 3rd smallest cog. Then I pull as much slack through as I can by hand and tighten the clamping bolt down. Now, when we spin the cranks, the derailleur is going to pull across to the smallest cog. And what that's going to do is pull any extra slack through. Now with any luck, this will get you pretty close and you can make the finer adjustments with the barrel adjuster. Now what I do is flick through all the gears and see if it's easy to change from big cogs to small cogs or from small cogs to big cogs. After doing it a few times, not only do you get all the cables seated, you also know which way you need to adjust. Here is how I remember which way to turn the barrel adjuster. Now if the gears are struggling to go from small cogs to bigger cogs, then the barrel adjuster needs to be turned clockwise. If the chain is struggling to go from big cogs to small cogs, then you need to turn the barrel adjuster anti-clockwise. Just remember that, because it's always good to know when you're out on the road and your gears need a slight adjustment. I then had a quick look at the high and low limit screws again on the rear, and everything was actually looking good. The front derailleur was also working well now that the rear gears are all set up, so we're looking good there.
Aren't you always so clever?
Now onto this integrated saddle, and can we get the saddle height correct? Will we be able to get it perfect for me and my bike fit, or will it be too short and all of this has been in vain and my gamble would have failed? Now first on the list is to get this saddle attached to this 65-pound, yeah, 65-pound clamp. Still not over it. Now to do that, it's a bit of a fiddle, but I got the seat connected, and once it is connected, I can then slide the clamp onto the integrated carbon seat tube. As I said earlier, I know I need my seat at 755mm, so 75.5 centimeters. So measuring the saddle height, we are just over 74 centimeters, so pretty close, but we need to go higher. That is where these spacers come in. So I can remove the saddle, place a couple of spacers into the clamp and place it back on the frame again. I measured and we are at 75.5 centimeters, bang on, and I am so relieved that this is not too short. Now from my bike fit, I also know my reach measurement, and from the ALM on the saddle to the rear of the hoods should be 80 centimeters. So out came the tape measure again. Obviously the bars need to be totally straight for this to be accurate. The measurement that I got was around 83, so too far. I nudged the seat forward on the rails to reduce the reach, and this gave me a measurement of around 81 centimeters, which I am happy with for now. Now with everything on, I can then align the handlebars with the front wheel. So I loosen the stem bolts, rotate the bars so that they are in line with the wheel, and tighten them up gradually to 6 Newton meters. The pedals are straightforward. I had some Shimano SPD pedals. I chucked them on the bike, remembering that the left pedal does up counterclockwise, which is a reverse of a normal thread. For the bar tape, I brought some 12-pound Pro logo, Pro logo. I've not used it before, but I like giving different bar tape a try. It's not my favorite thing to install. Now, I normally follow this Park Tools video when installing because I haven't quite saved the technique to my muscle memory yet.
He is incompetent.
For the big moment, how much does she weigh and what was the cost? Now I chuck her on the scale and we have a total weight of, drumroll please, 7,285 grams. Now the Giant was 8,505 grams, so that gives us a weight saving of 1,220 grams, 1.2 kilos. Now I'm pretty impressed with that. I just need to lose the same amount for my belly. We have also spent a grand total of £158.98, but that is without the wheels. But overall, I am happy with this, and now I have one of the brightest bikes in London.
Hello.
Beautiful wife.
Hello.
What do you think about my new bike?
It is gorgeous.
Do you think it matches my skin tone?
Yeah, it complements it so well.